Roger Williams University is hosting a crisis management seminar on May 3rd at their Providence campus. Crises, whether a natural disaster, cyber attack, or financial instability, can have severe repercussions if not handled properly. This is where crisis management plays a pivotal role. Join Roger Williams MBA students and expert speakers to learn how to prepare for the unexpected. The program is totally free and open to the public. You can register online at rwu.edu/events/crisis-management-symposium. Today, we continue our special report on Rhode Island's housing crisis with Caitlyn Frumerie of the Rhode Island Coalition to End Homelessness.
This is the Bartholomew Town Podcast.
The legalization of recreational cannabis that went into effect last year can open doors for your career. If you are already in the industry or wondering what is the best path to break into the cannabis field, well, the University of Rhode Island has a program to help you become highly competitive in numerous areas of the cannabis industry. Fully accredited by URI's College of Pharmacy, the certificate program is 100% online, and it can be completed in 2 semesters. The next application deadline for the summer 2023 session is April 4th, and courses start on May 9th. You can learn more at uri.edu/online/cannabis or give them a call at 401-874-5280. Continuing our look at Rhode Island's housing crisis and continuing our assessment of the crisis of the unhoused, and certainly a fundamental aspect to all of this, perhaps even a building block or foundation, I should say, for the entire conversation around housing. And joining us is from the Rhode Island Coalition to End Homelessness, Caitlyn Frumerie. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having me here and covering this issue with such focus and intensity. We're really grateful for you bringing everybody together this week.
Yeah,
in the past too.
Well, it's one of those things that it's like to me, it's the big issue. You know, you can look at so many different things, and we do need to think about education, obviously, and there's social justice elements, which are critical, climate elements, transportation, infrastructure, economic development, you know, you name it, it's all there. But at the end of the day, if housing isn't stabilized, that exacerbates social justice problems, climate problems, educational problems, ... workforce problems. So how do we not view this as the crisis of our times, which here in Rhode Island, even though we had a realtor on earlier this week who said, well, you know, we're actually, you know, relative to other places, we're kind of an affordable place to live. It's like, you know, no, we're not. And people are struggling at all levels except for the very, very top.
Absolutely. So. Yeah. And I love everything that you have said. I think it's 100% accurate. You know, you do even data matching with the homeless system data that's in our database that tracks pretty much everybody that comes out of in and out of shelters. If they see an outreach worker, they call in looking for help, and we can match that with, you know, the healthcare system or with, you know, lots of different data sources. And what we see, you know, kids that don't have a place to stay don't do as well in schools, right? Kids that don't have a place to stay are experiencing trauma and, you know, may have more complicated medical or behavioral issues, or, you know, even if you are disabled or struggle with a mental illness, facing homelessness, facing housing insecurity. So in some ways, housing is the silver bullet to really tackling so many things. And as you mentioned, housing is a crisis for everyone, right? Even those that are like myself are very privileged, but it's a challenge even, you know, for me as a renter to find places that meet needs of myself. And I am exceptionally privileged in comparison to somebody that is living outside and, you know, trying to just get their basic needs met.
Definitely. Exactly. No question about it. So looking at right now, one thing that pops up in the wake of the encampment at the State House, which, if nothing else, served as this major platform for people who probably don't normally pay attention to this stuff, for lack of a better term, to look at this crisis and go, oh, okay, now I get it a little bit more. At the same time, there's so much more to it. We look at the demolition of this housing unhoused camp in Woonsocket that has so many tragic results, and sort of the, I don't want to say nonchalant nature of that the Baldelli Hunt administration has taken, but certainly, you wonder, like, where's the humanity in this? But then also, where's the data? And that's what you guys are so good at. Talk about the coordinated entry system and how it's juxtaposed with the number of people who are experiencing homelessness right now.
Yeah, and I will say our coordinated entry system is the way that people access services, housing, shelter when they're in crisis. It's a hotline 365 days a year. You can also kind of chat and text too. So there's some different ways to interact with the system if phone is an issue for you. And really, the analogy that I make is it's a lot like a 911 dispatch. So if we think about police and ambulance and fire, you call 911 to have fire trucks sent out to your house that's on fire. But the challenge we have with the coordinated entry system is that there isn't enough to keep with the analogy, enough shelter beds, enough resources. So then you don't have enough fire trucks. So it's me having someone call saying, my house is on fire, I need help. And I have to say, the wait list, I'm so sorry, I can't send a fire truck out to you today. I can send one in 30 days because I have 50 other fires that are ahead of you, and we've got to get to them first, and then we can get to your fire. And for someone in crisis that is wondering how they're going to keep themselves warm, where their next meal is going to come from, that's a really devastating answer to receive. So what the coordinated entry system, and I was just actually pulling up our numbers from the last week. So as of the last week, which ended the 21st, we had over 1,300 unique calls. When we deduplicate them by callers, that's 442 individuals calling, seeking services. So that's a regular influx of new people that are presenting. A lot of people were able to find housing kind of over the holidays. But now that kind of holiday period is ending, we're getting towards the end of the month where maybe the check that they got at the beginning from Social Security, pension, whatever it would be, they've spent and are now in need of shelter again. So we have a large number that are consistently calling every week. Those remain considerably high. And what we're seeing is those that can get into shelter when a resource becomes available, a bed, apartment, whatever it is, they're staying longer because there's not enough housing on the back end. So it backs this whole system up because, theoretically, we could have enough resources in the system as it is without adding more if everybody was spending very little time in a shelter and was exiting to housing, but there isn't the housing on the back end. So then what you see is increasing number of people living outside. And for our kind of last 2 weeks, that's about 306. So we had saw a dip down. We were in the kind of 400s and 500s in December and November and October, but the holidays, it went down, which is great. People were able to find housing. We also had resources like the Armory and others that came online, but we're seeing it creep back up again. So we're back in the 300s. So when there's not enough places for people to stay, they go outside.
They go outside, and sometimes that creates tragic results, as we also saw in Woonsocket over the weekend. And that's according to Steve Alquist and his reporting through Uprise, that's more common than you would imagine. Now, there was a back and forth at one point, and this was primarily during the State House issue of, the governor's office and really Josh Saul, who, let's face it, I mean, nice guy. He's been on the show, handsome dude. Apparently he's a good electronic musician, has a lot of talent in a lot of areas, completely unfit for the role of coordinating agencies, nonprofits, and humans and communicating with the media. So this issue exploded and became more controversial on an internal level than it ever needed to be. And one of those controversies was the dispute between the governor's office and the coalition on the number of homeless encampments around the state. How do you square that? What is that? What was that whole thing all about? Was that really just hey, this was the person who should have been in the middle there, Josh Saul, or a designee of his, didn't coordinate that communication properly? Or, is there a way to look at the number of people who are unhoused or the number of encampments and say, yeah, that can be disputed, and the governor's got credibility on that question?
Yeah, I mean, I can't necessarily speak to conversations in rooms that I wasn't in, right? So necessarily what happened in kind of the governor's side, I mean, I don't doubt for a minute that our state, cares about Rhode Islanders and cares about people living outside. I think that we might agree to disagree on how to address it or what that looks like sometimes, but ultimately I can just say, that our data, particularly who is outside and how many, is very accurate. Now, what I can't do is tell you the geolocation of every person that's experiencing homelessness, right? Like I can tell you well, I wouldn't for confidentiality reasons, but generally I have the names, I have the demographics, I have the contact numbers, I have the situations of those 300 plus people that are outside, when they last called, interacted. So that data is very accurate. And if I had 300 beds to get online tomorrow, I could call all of those people and get them in somewhere if they were still facing homelessness and were interested in whatever resource I was offering. So that is really accurate, consistent data that we've had, that we continue to have. Where it gets more complicated, and it's the nature of encampments, is when you're trying to gelocate where somebody is in a particular moment of time. So encampments inherently are going to be hidden and quiet because people are afraid of getting their encampment cleared. And
Sure.
I wonder why, when you look at what's happened in Woonsocket, why people may not want that information to be publicly known. So it's actually sometimes very hard to find them. The data that we'd had is we had done kind of informal, kind of qualitative collection of where street outreach would say, okay, this is how many encampments I roughly have in this part of the state. Encampments are usually, it's not one person doesn't make an encampment. It's usually a couple of households residing in a location. And because of the crisis, what might have started as, 3 or 4 households residing in an encampment quickly escalates to maybe 10, 15, at one point, I think at the State House, there was close to 40 persons there. So they can grow because people learn, okay, this is maybe a place that I can stay that has some safety from, for whatever reason. So the encampments are something that's always evolving. So we knew that there were approximately 80 based on street outreach reports in the fall, had shared that with the state. But it's not a data element that's tracked in HMIS because it changes so much, and there are security concerns about that because encampments get cleared. But what we are doing, and what we do every year, is what's called a point in time count, and that's actually going to be tomorrow night. So we have, scores of volunteers and outreach workers that are covering really the entire state of Rhode Island, Woonsocket to Newport, Westerly to Pawtucket, to go out and physically count and interact and survey and provide resources, supplies to individuals outside. So we both do a count tomorrow night, and we do a survey over the remaining days. So there are some encampments, particularly out in the rural areas of the state, Foster, Gloucester, Scituate, Richmond, parts of West Warwick, where it's really hard to find and get to them. But when we go to the meal site the next day and survey people, we'll know, okay, this is who was outside. And then we take that information and we deduplicate it. So we're about to have a really accurate sense of, again, who is unsheltered and roughly the geographic region. But I think focusing on how many encampments and where they are is a little bit missing the forest through the trees. What we really want to focus on is who's outside, who's in our shelter, and how can we make the system more effective so that people are getting in and they're out of homelessness quickly and into housing. And, we're hopeful that the new housing Secretary Pryor and his team will be, effective in making those kind of systems changes. Yes. But our data is accurate. Encampments are squishy, obviously, for many reasons, but actually knowing who is unsheltered, that is consistent, reliable data that we have, that we've always had, and will continue to share and provide until, every Rhode Islander has a place to stay.
Yeah, well said. And I think also it's important to remember that what you led off with here, that there's a confidentiality aspect to this. And some people would say, well, wait a second, you get X funding dollars. This is supposed to be a partnership with the state, and it's that fine line of it's not, you're not in a medical privacy protection. This isn't a spousal protection or attorney-client privilege, but it's in that category of, you're not going to quote unquote turn people over to the system and set them up for their home, which may be an encampment, to be demolished. And that's admirable. And I think that the people in charge know that deep down. They're not, for the most part, I'm pretty sure that they know that. So the challenge then becomes what we've learned all week through these conversations on this series, kind of like the most duh thing you could think of, but we need more housing. We need more housing. We need more space.
100%.
And that's everything else is this kind of, ballet, this kind of performance of, just like molding the moment and hoping for the best outcome for as many people as possible until there's more housing to move people out of encampments into, without restrictions about, people complain sometimes, look, I'm a medical cannabis patient, this shelter, I can't go there because I can't use my medicine.
I have a pet that I need with me for therapeutic reasons.
Totally.
Right. Yep.
Or I've had a bad experience, or I don't want to go to a Catholic facility because, I was a victim of sexual assault, or I've been, I'm a member of the LGBTQ plus community, and I don't want to be around an organization that condemns my lifestyle, quote unquote. That's, as they would put it. So they being the church in some cases. So there's all these little micro factors, and those are all important to analyze and understand. But what really matters is that people who are outside have a place to go. That's the issue.
I completely agree. And, like I said, I mentioned seeing the forest through the trees. Sometimes that's what I feel like we end up doing. And all of this work is hard. And, we have tremendous organizations, some of which you have spoken today, that are out doing the work every day. But the housing piece is so challenging because you're navigating local politics, you're navigating NIMBYism and not in my backyard, funding sources. And the way that affordable housing has typically been funded in the past is a lot of little pockets of money from a lot of different sources. So you're doing what's called like subsidy layering, and you're trying to make everybody happy, each of these little funding source, and nobody wants to necessarily be the first in, because what if the other money doesn't happen? So these developers, particularly our community development corporations, it's horrifically challenging to build these units all over the state. And that's the focus really needs to be, how do we get those housing units online? And then as the Homeless Coalition director, I'm going to say, okay, how do we get those units online dedicated to people experiencing homelessness? Because services and really subsidizing at a level that it's affordable to somebody who's making $6,000 a year, $12,000 a year, or is on Social Security, that's another piece. It's hard enough to build housing as it is, but then when you have to invest even more money to make it affordable to somebody who really can't contribute as much because they make so little. So that's the piece that we really need to be doing a lot of work on. And I'm a little bit afraid sometimes when we spend as much time as we are talking now, that what's actually happening to keep this from happening next winter or next year? Like, what's that pipeline look like? Because it's not just, we fought tremendously for resources to come online tonight, but I don't want people in shelter. I want people in housing. So how do we make that happen? And we cannot do that alone. That needs to be everybody, political, municipal, government, realtors, everybody.
Boom. Absolutely. No question about it. And the general public as a whole.
Yes,
look,
yes,
the
yes.
NIMBYism that we've seen. And look, I said this in an episode earlier this week with Karen Santilli and Jen Hawkins, that, it's easy to look at Cranston and say, oh, the mayor and this, that, and the other, they're anti-homelessness. And look, I think they're balancing constituent demands, maybe a lack of perspective in some cases, answering to some kind of wacko, far right media that's, obsessed with this story. But look, here in South Providence, I'm in Elmwood right now. I recall a story where an effort was made for high school students to build essentially tiny houses in an area. And there was a community uprise here where people said, hey, look, we don't want that. We don't want to have that type of campus in our neighborhood. And so it's not just limited. And look, it's easy to look at some of these headline grabbing stories and say that's where the problem is. But it really is, everybody has to take a look around and say, what kind of world do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a world that is, you've got people dying on park benches in Woonsocket because they can't find somewhere to go, and homeless camps getting bulldozed, and then up the ladder it goes. People who are working full time, unable to find housing. People who are working full time, millennials that are paying $2,100. They want you to live in the Superman building for $3,000 for a 1-bedroom a month and clap like a seal because it's so wonderful and you're going to be able to walk to some cafe. I mean, this whole thing is out of control. And it starts with everybody looking around and just going, yeah, let's work together.
Right. And I think that's one thing that, if people really, it's all relational, right? Like we're Rhode Island, we're a small state. I think that sometimes if community members or just whomever, if once you really interact with someone that has a different life perspective than you on like a personal one-to-one level, that's really illuminating because you start to understand like, oh, there but for the grace of God or deity or the universe, that could have happened to me, right? Like I could envision how, you might have someone who loses a loved one they were caregiving for, then they're no longer able to stay at that Section 8 apartment because that person has passed, that they were helping, or, maybe they have depression or anxiety from, the COVID or grief or something. Like there's all these circumstances that you could find yourself in a really tough spot. And I think a lot of people assume the safety net is there. There's no safety net. You don't have a right to shelter in Rhode Island. When you experience homelessness, you call and get put on a list until you wait to get whatever resource it is. It's not even families. Like it's not an instant thing. There are communities that do have right to shelter or other kind of housing programs, New York and Massachusetts, but there's no safety net there. You're really falling. You're free falling. And I don't know that people always understand that and are quick to kind of do judgment. And so that's one of the things that, that I think the coalition can do a better job of. And even just as community members of, asking questions, interacting with people, not to dismiss someone who's panhandling or struggling, and also not just assume that that's what homelessness looks like. Chronic homelessness really only accounts for maybe 20-30% of the overall population. Most people experience homelessness, job loss, family crisis, domestic violence, and it's pretty brief for them. They have something that happens, they fall into it. It's not as brief now because the economy and the housing market's so bad, but it's people who are working, it's people who are it's the other kids in your school that your child is playing with. So it's also not what everybody thinks it is. It looks different across the state and across the population. So I think just interacting and asking questions and being human really helps illuminate the issue in a way that more than just a number does.
So well said. That's such a great bite right there that I'm going to pull out and kind of have ready to fire away when needed.
Go for it. Yeah.
All right. Last question here. The coalition is very active. You've been excellent in being in front of the media, certainly on WPRO and here on the podcast and, and elsewhere as well. I mean, I can say for sure, but, if you could communicate one thing right now to the administration in Rhode Island, and when I say that, I don't just mean the governor, I mean the Speaker of the House, I mean the Senate President, I mean the quote unquote people in charge. What would you say to them? If you had 30 seconds in an elevator and they're there with you, what do you say to them?
I mean, I would first thank them, because you always want to thank for what we have received to date.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there has been more money and resources coming in, but what I would ask and what I hope to continue to see is just massive investments in housing and homelessness and services, and what the people on the street and what the providers that are serving are saying they need. And it's not just enough to put the money in the budget, but then you actually have to get it on the ground. And I think that's been some of the challenge, which, hey, I get the state has a ton of ARPA money. We're trying to get so much out the door, but you need to have staff that can manage that and get those monies out, and also staff that are policy. So if we look at, I'm thinking a lot about Commerce, because that's where our new secretary had come from. Commerce Corp has a technical assistance arm. They're meeting with businesses. They're trying to bust barriers. There's work that's happening, even just beyond money, to make sure that having a business in Rhode Island is something that works for everyone, and whatever challenge they might done is figured out. And I think that's the level of support and infrastructure you need for an issue like housing. How do we help those developers get those projects done? What does that look like? It's money, but it's also getting money out fast. It's getting contracts out fast. It's getting those policy decisions to be done thoughtfully, consistently. And the staff, there really hasn't been the capacity. In a lot of ways, I think Secretary Saul had an impossible job, because the staff and the resources weren't really there. And so I'm hoping that we can all debrief what's happened and make sure that infrastructure is there, because it's not enough to just put money in a budget, but you actually need to then kind of get it out and show the public too, like, hey, this is how this is being spent. Hey, this is the dashboard of how many units we've created. This is how we're addressing it, so that the community also feels part of it, because they're seeing, oh, this is where my resource is going. Oh, this is how my community can get involved, because this resource is flowing. So I think I'm looking forward to a really kind of this next step, and what hopefully we can build together.
Caitlyn Frumerie, Rhode Island Coalition to End Homelessness. Thanks for the work you do, and thanks for being here today.
Same to you. This was a wonderful conversation, and I just have to say how much I appreciate your perspective all of this, and the time that you've invested. And I can tell that you've really done your homework, and so that makes these types of interviews all the more wonderful to be on, because it's a real kind of conversation. I'm not feeling like I have to necessarily educate you on the issue, because you're coming in hot with the info. So I just want to say how much I'm grateful for your coverage of this, because it's going to really make a difference. Like, this is the stuff that moves the work that needs to happen forward.
That means a lot. And I'll just say that's the job, and I don't see how you can do it any other way besides go all in. And, unless you're covering, the parade that, Memorial Day parade, and which balloons were the best at, or whatever. How can you not go all in on these issues and try to understand them for what they are? And I also do hope that this week's conversation set, including this one today, which I also really enjoyed, but all of them provoke some kind of in-person summit. And there's been whispers of it, but I'd love to see in the room the leaders of the from the state, the leaders from the advocacy area, leaders from the banking sector, leaders from the real estate industry sector, including developers, municipal leaders, journalists, and other people who have been covering this, and social scientists from an academic perspective, people who are unhoused, people who are experiencing struggling paying rent, people who are struggling to buy their first home, people who are struggling because of Airbnb and short-term rent. All of these people in a room, door locked, until we come out with solutions, and we can blow black smoke like when they elect a new pope out of the top of the state house.
I love it. Absolutely.
But what are we doing?
Yeah.
What are we waiting on here?
Right.
What are we waiting on to attack this? We have got to take this as seriously as some football team getting ready for the Super Bowl, or that level of preparation. Like, it's a moment, and we need to meet the moment with incredible intensity. And you guys are already doing that. So it's like preaching to the choir, but
Right. I agree. And I mean, I was a consultant for HUD and worked in a lot of other states before I joined this. And, the communities that really do this well have annual summits, annual conferences. There's a lot of that work. I don't know about the black smoke. You might be onto something new and novel there. But really the communities, they're attacking it like the real emergency that it is. And it's a legacy for our kids at the end of the day. I mean, housing is not getting any more affordable. And, the crisis we have with college education is going to pale in comparison to the housing crisis that we are walking ourselves into. So
right.
A lot of kids are going to be staying at home a lot longer. If this keeps
so true.
up.
And it does happen in other countries, in South America, I can say for sure people stay later. But, we need to attack this problem here in Rhode Island as if, like we found out that the moon was, discovered to be rapidly crashing towards it. And it's going to hit. The first thing it's going to hit is the top of the Johnston landfill. And it's going to roll over the state of Rhode Island and it's just going to squash us. Like that same intensity. All right, who can solve this? There's going to be a military component. Maybe we can blow the thing up. Maybe there's going to be, an astrophysicist. There's going to be a psychological preparation. What are we going to do in case we can't figure it out immediately? All of these different things. I hope the moon doesn't ever crash because I like looking at
right.
the moon.
Yeah. Hopefully not. I hear it's made of cheese though. So maybe, I don't know. Right?
Well, as a vegan, that would make it all the more painful for me if I'm getting rolled over a giant thing of cheese. What a way to go.
Nut cheese. We don't know. I mean, we're in a nut cheese renaissance.
That's right. Cashew cheese.
Right. The last thing I'll mention that you kind of made me think of when you're talking about getting people in a room, another strategy that a lot of other states and communities have had success with in an interagency council on homelessness. So kind of keeping in mind, particularly with homelessness, that it's not just one entity that can kind of fix it all, that it's a mental health component, there's a corrections component, there's a DCYF component. So a lot of governors and mayors have been able to enact councils that then meet regularly, all are kind of coming at that together, like the scientists and the military. And so that is another opportunity for, the leadership that we have to say, all right, we're going to put the political weight and the capital behind this, and let's get an interagency council specifically for homelessness. Let's reinvigorate and expand, what the Housing Resource Commission or whatever these other entities that are kind of overseeing housing work, how can we make that what it needs to be? And I will happily bring baked goods to whatever lock ourselves in a room is going to happen and fully support that idea.
Yeah, I completely agree. And let's see what happens here. So
let's see what we can get. All right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. You have my cell. Feel free to text or call. If I'm happy to come on whenever. And we will support you in whatever way we can.
Likewise. And thank you so much.
At HealthSource RI for Employers, we provide access to health insurance to more than 1,100 local businesses and nonprofits, and 96% of them renew through us every year. Maybe it's our choice of 19 different health plans, our 10 years of customizing solutions, or our one local team of dedicated experts helping employers find quality health insurance. See how our numbers stack up for you. Learn more at healthsourceri.com/employers.